Hi, Scott Scheferman here, Principal Strategist at Eclipsian. Today, I want to talk to you about our July Below the Surface Threat Report and give you my hot take. The three things I want you to walk away from after you read all of that and say, oh my gosh, because July was a hot one. The first takeaway, and this is a bold statement, but perhaps a necessary one at this point, certainly true of 2021, definitely true of 2020, and maybe it's been true the whole time, the last 20, 30 years, and we just didn't realize it until recently. And that is that implicit trust of large OEM vendors and software houses and manufacturers of devices that are security controls, etc., the things we put our trust in, the lifeblood of our enterprise, the things that are there to protect our users, our customers, patients, their lives, those things we can no longer implicitly trust. So implicit trust is dead. Now, what do I mean by implicit trust? I mean the ability to trust something just because you've identified that it is what it says it is, and it comes from some place or some brand that you know and like and trust. Okay, that whole paradigm, done. It's been done in the malware world for a long time in terms of certificate trust, whether a piece of code is signed or not, should not inform you as to whether or not it is malicious. We learned that lesson in the AV, EDR, XDR space, but we haven't learned it in the broader sense of why we've been doing it wrong by implicitly trusting these vendors. So what do I mean by that? If you look at some of the largest vendors, let's say Microsoft, they create the operating system upon which everything is resting and relying and trusting. And yet we're shipping bugs that are NTLM bugs, that are bugs in printer related software in domain controllers. We're printing a nightmare's worth of bugs in the year 2021. And these are the kinds of bugs that should be caught during a secure software development lifecycle. The kind of bugs for which I am absolutely certain that there are people inside in every organization like this, but Microsoft, for example, that know better, that know that there are ways to actually do this via an SSDLC process that ensures that that vulnerable code is not shipped from an organization. It's also true that you can't implicitly trust these organizations just because you trust their provenance or you trust their brand. You can't, even if they have the best SSDLC intentions and processes and tools, both active and static, to review code before it ships, doesn't mean that they haven't themselves been attacked by adversaries that would like to implant, modify, or manipulate that source code right before it ships in the form of updates. Source code. So implicit trust is dead. It's not just true of Microsoft. It's true. Look at any major OEM vendor that makes VPN appliances, as an example. These are a critical security control that the entire organization relies upon, so much so that they're often not even updated because they're so critical you can't bring them down. How ironic is that? Yet bad guys are getting in there, remotely executing code and using the device to get passwords or create accounts and then come back later after selling those creds to a third-party actor that goes in and logs in as a normal user and then does the damn thing in terms of dropping ransomware as a service, etc. These critical devices have critical vulnerabilities, and that should not be the case. If there's any appliance out there that should be robust enough to face the internet publicly and be exposed to every threat actor on Earth or outer space for that matter, it needs to be these devices. And yet they're all succumbing to remote code execution vulnerabilities, to privilege escalation vulnerabilities, whether it's a static code analysis or whether it's fuzzing or active testing. These devices are falling down left and right. And so, again, should you implicitly trust a VPN appliance just because it has a large brand name on there that you've trusted over the last 25 years in IT? The answer is no, and please do not. Another example of devices that we should not trust would be the laptops and servers that our entire enterprise and all of our users use day in and day out. These things by large OEM names that you and I have grown up with, Dell, HP, Acer, Asus, all of these also have a whole set of vulnerabilities on any given Sunday. And yet even those large OEMs are shipping devices that should be configured securely. It should have no vulnerabilities, at least in the firmware and the BIOS level, at the UEFI level. They shouldn't have any of that if we trust those vendors. And it's because we're trusting them implicitly. And it's because they have impunity in that regard, meaning even if a researcher finds something, it's not like they're going to get fined for it, right? Or called out. We've normalized the fact that code is being shipped broken, insecure, and backdoored. We've normalized that as industry. So what does that mean? Well, this brings me to my second takeaway, which I'm going to frame to you in the form of a question rather than a statement. The question is, do you and I think or believe earnestly that we have a new dynamic in this industry in the last 10 years or so with these software houses and OEMs effectively, whether it's intentional or not, effectively offloading the burden of secure software development lifecycle to third parties? Third parties like bug bounty programs and security researchers, and third parties like threat actors in the wild, exploiting them and compromising organizations before bugs are found. Do we think that's actually a true dynamic? Because if it is, it's an if statement, if it is, we have a big problem. And the problem centers around the fact that even if it's an effective means of finding bugs by matrixing out to a large researcher community and paying them money and incentivizing them, all good things, even if that's true, it's not being done fast enough to get to the bug before the product code ships to the customer and is vulnerable and exploited in the wild. It's a simple time problem. It's not that it's not effective in finding bugs. By God, it's incredibly effective at finding bugs. Finding them too late to matter is the problem. So I formed that in the form of a question. Do we think that's a dynamic? And if so, we have a problem. And without speaking too much further on that, I'm going to go right to the third one. The third takeaway from this month's Below the Surface Threat Report. And that is, if 1 and 2 are true, we should no longer implicitly trust OEMs, and the SSDLC is by and large broken, even amongst the best organizations, then we as enterprises have to ask ourselves a question. What's left for me to do that I can do, that I have security control over, that is in my authority to actually control, and via processes and people and technology, that's left to counter this problem, right? And the answer is, yeah, you have things you absolutely must be doing. We all do. And we've known these things for a long time. But in the face of what's going on in the actual threat landscape the last several years, I don't think there's a dial that goes to a big enough volume 11 to describe just how imperative it is to find and mitigate or remediate vulnerabilities fast enough to matter. That last part is critical. Can you do it fast enough? I don't even care if you do it super accurately or with full visibility. I care certainly that you do it fast enough to matter, because that speed is really the only thing that matters against the modern adversary, both criminal or nation state. So we know this is true in general, but when it comes to firmware, since I work here at Eclipsium, I have special insight there. And what our customers tell us after they install Eclipsium for the first time as a platform, and it discovers things like firmware vulnerabilities that are exploitable or have been exploited in the wild, or are being exploited right now in the wild, like all these VPN vulnerabilities that the Russian SVR, Chinese APT40 and APT31 are actively hitting in campaigns, that probably 9 or 10 ransomware groups off the top of my head right now are hitting in the wild to gain initial access into organizations before they drop ransomware as a service payloads. All of this is happening. And yet, as organizations, we fail to get better and faster at patching. So when it comes to firmware, what organizations have often missed is they've kind of relegated it to that thing I can't see, so therefore I don't worry about it. That thing I don't have enough human resources to understand and do, so therefore I don't worry about it. That thing that is kind of sketchy and dangerous and hard to do, because if I do a firmware update and it goes wrong, I brick a critical device, so I'm just going to leave that sucker running 30 years vulnerable, so I don't worry about it. There's all these firmware kind of stigmatisms. Stigmatas? Stigmatas? Stigmailas? I don't know what they are. But these things are preventing us from doing it right. And doing it right matters these days because you have all of these actors actively hitting this firmware, this level of code, that device operating system it's externally facing in the wild over and over again. You have criminal actors like TrickBot, which is the largest criminal organization that's cyber related that I'm aware of. It's probably the world's largest multinational criminal intelligence organization, if you really want to put a bunch of adjectives around what they actually are. And they have a module called TrickBoot that's looking to be able to brick or implant at the UEFI layer of a device that malware lands on. So we're in this new era where it matters. And if we don't get ahead of patching and we don't have a way to do that, we're going to fall down. We're going to again be surprised when we open the newspaper, just like we were when SolarWinds hit, just like we were when all these Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities hit, just like we all were when Pulse Secure had an O-Day being hit by multiple actors. These things can no longer afford to catch us off guard. We have to anticipate, lean in, and get the job done. And it's easier said than done, but now it's not impossible. Now there are tools like Eclipsium and other tools that allow you to go into your organization, understand your devices, see your vulnerabilities, prioritize them, understand which have activity related to things in the wild or things related to the MITRE attack, 18CK framework. You have all sorts of language and capability to put things like vulnerabilities in the proper context against mission or enterprise risk or patient clinical risk. You can do that today. It wasn't easy to do that the last 20, 30 years. It is now. So let's get on with it and do this thing so we can get ahead of the threat actors that are hitting things. You know, the last thing I'll leave you with on that last note is we have a researcher here who shall remain nameless for now that looked into an OEM device make and model that shall remain nameless for now. And in the course of an afternoon, discovered 17,000 or so of these devices publicly facing on the internet that are not honeypots that were validated. And these things have lots of vulnerabilities. In fact, 90% of that 17,000 had vulnerabilities in end of service or end of life firmware operating system that they're still running, 90% of them. Half of those had firmware that was 3 years old and had a plethora of vulnerabilities related to it. There's even devices on the same make and model lineage, if you will, that are 15 years old, which is more than half of the age of the researcher that discovered all this. We look forward to sharing more of those details later. But I have a question I'm going to end with, okay? If I called you Mrs. or Mr. CISO tomorrow, and I said, I am looking at a VPN appliance that is exposed to the internet that I can easily exploit and gain remote code execution on right now, and it's yours. I recommend you do something about it. Hang up, so to speak, right after the conversation. Would you, Mr. or Mrs. CISO, take action that day or at least that week to fix that? And I believe out of those 17,000 for this one device, right, that most of those CISOs or leaders or IT ops or NextSecOps folks would in fact actually patch the device. So what I think is happening is organizations don't have the visibility and they don't have a dashboard that racks and stacks and prioritizes. Of course, I'm leading you down the path to why our customers buy Eclipsium, because if you don't have the visibility and the understanding of risk, you can't understand actual risk enough to put it on the risk register for the enterprise, to describe to the other stakeholders in an organization what things happen on a bad day when it's related to firmware or a VPN device going down. If you don't have those tools, you're not going to get the budget, the staff, the resources, or the tooling needed and the cadence needed to get ahead of the threat landscape. So with that, I leave you with a humble recommendation to go ahead and try out Eclipsium, put it in your environment, let it open your eyes, and at least register that risk and get that conversation going internally so you can decide to ignore the risk or address the risk. It's really a binary decision. And that's the decision we're all faced with today because of everything we just talked about related to software supply chain, vulnerable code that's getting shipped by even the biggest manufacturers, OEMs, and software code houses. And the fact that we have this time delay where on any given Sunday, attackers are hitting devices that have been vulnerable but aren't being patched, even if there is a patch. Thank you for listening. We look forward to your feedback on July's Below the Surface Threat Report. And this is me, Scott Scheferman, Principal Strategist here at Eclipsium, now signing off.